Now particularly talking about Rule 28 Sub Rule 2. Notwithstanding anything in 28.1. So you forget whatever you studied in 28.1. Now particularly for one type of transaction which is giving of corporate guarantees. One thing in relation to guarantee we have already studied in the chapter of supply. That if a director is giving personal guarantee to the company, director being a related person of the company, this transaction will now be falling under deemed supply even without consideration. But because of RBI provisions, you cannot ever charge consideration to give a personal guarantee as a director, and therefore open market value is only zero. Therefore value of supply is also zero. Got it, ma'am? Now what we are talking about in Rule 28 Sub Rule 2 is with respect to corporate guarantees. That is with respect to corporate guarantee. So here we are saying that, let us say company ABC is the holding company of company XYZ being a subsidiary company. Company XYZ wants to take a loan from the bank, and therefore this related person ABC Limited being the related person of XYZ Limited is giving guarantee, corporate guarantee on behalf of XYZ Limited to bank. Now tell me who is supplier and who is recipient. First of all, for the service of corporate guarantee, who is supplier and who is recipient? For the particular supply of corporate guarantee, who is supplier and who is recipient? Ma'am, we understand that the person giving the corporate guarantee, ABC, is going to be the supplier here. And the person for whom guarantee is given to the bank, who is taking the benefit of this guarantee, XYZ Limited, is going to be recipient. Right, ma'am? And they both are related person here because holding subsidiary relationship. We understand. So should this be valued according to Rule 28? Yes, ma'am. Now here we are saying again. Here again we are saying that, see, if my recipient is eligible for full ITC on this corporate guarantee, then to whatever I declare in the invoice for giving guarantee, that will only be accepted. But if my recipient, who is located in India, I am saying that my recipient who is taking the loan should be located in India only. This is an amendment now, which means if guarantee is given to a company outside India being related person, it will not fall under Rule 28.1. Particularly, recipient has to be in India who is taking the loan. Then in that case we are saying that this will fall under Rule 28 because two related companies are entering into a transaction where one related company is giving corporate guarantee to another related company to take loans, and the company taking the loan should be a company in India only. If ITC is available to that company for corporate guarantee service, then to whatever we declare in the invoice will only be accepted as the value of supply. But if ITC is not available, if ITC is not available for any reason, it could be possible that my related company who is taking the loan is not even registered. It is possible they cannot take ITC. Now what to do? So here we are saying that if the company taking the loan, availing the corporate guarantee services, is not eligible for full ITC, then what should be the value of supply? Here we are not saying open market value, etc., anything. No. Government has given a straight away formula to calculate the value of supply. Government is saying whatever is the guarantee offered per annum. This per annum word is also now added via amendment. I will explain you the significance of the same in next 2 minutes. Okay, ma'am. So whatever is the guarantee offered per annum, 1% of the same, or what actual consideration my related company is charging to give me corporate guarantee, whichever is higher will be taken as the value of supply. See, understand, 1% is the taken of the guarantee amount and not the loan amount. So let's assume my related company is taking a loan for 50 lakh rupees, but I am giving a guarantee only of 40 lakh rupees. So 1% will have to be taken of 40 lakh and not of 50 lakh. So what is the loan amount is not relevant here. For what amount guarantee is given is relevant here. So 1% should be taken of the guarantee amount. Second is, recipient can take full ITC irrespective of whether loan being actually disbursed or not. Okay. So here we are saying, if at all the recipient is eligible to take ITC on GST paid on corporate guarantees, recipient can take the ITC as soon as guarantee is being issued. what practically happens is once the company gives guarantee, bank will take some time, process the loan, then disburse the loan, and then the transaction is completed. A government is saying the transaction that we are talking about here is the corporate guarantee transaction and not the loan transaction. So my job, ABC Limited job will be over as soon as they issue the corporate guarantee. XYZ Limited will now take a loan from bank and all, that's a separate transaction. No. So whatever GST XYZ has paid to ABC only for corporate guarantee services, I can take the ITC once the guarantee is issued. Even if loan is not disbursed, that's absolutely fine. I don't have to wait for the loan to get disbursed to take the ITC for the guarantee service GST that I have paid. So recipient can take full ITC irrespective of loan being actually disbursed or not. Then we say, if the loan is taken over by another bank or financial institution under the same corporate guarantee, there will be no impact on GST. What we are saying, let us say my recipient XYZ initially took a loan from Axis Bank. Now this entire loan, let's say, is taken over or shifted to HDFC Bank. But the corporate guarantee still continues. ABC had guaranteed the loan, and till date also this loan is still continuing to be guaranteed by ABC only. Again, no GST impact will come. But let us say because of change of bank, I had to issue a fresh guarantee or this existing guarantee is now renewed. Then again, GST would be payable according to these terms only. Right, ma'am. Then we are saying if the guarantee is provided by more than one entity or a co-guarantor, then GST will be proportionate. So let us say XYZ Limited took a loan. There is a company ABC Limited holding 36% shares in XYZ. There's a company PQR Limited assume holding 52% shares. 52% shares in XYZ. Now we know that they both are related only because more than 25% shares you are related only. So now we say that these two people combinedly give a guarantee to XYZ to take a loan. The loan is, let's say, for 10 lakh rupees. ABC is providing guarantee for 3 lakh rupees and for 7 lakh rupees PQR is providing the guarantee. Then what we will simply do, we will apportion the amount. So here 1% of 3 lakh and here 1% of 7 lakh. So whatever is the total consideration, either you that apportion in ratio of 3:7 or 1% amount you apportion in the ratio of 3:7. So if two or more people are giving guarantees together, the amount is of course going to be proportionate according to the what guarantee I am giving. Right, ma'am. This point I'll explain you later. Then we say 1% amount is to be taken on per annum basis. So let's say my recipient is taking a loan of 10 lakh rupees for 5 years. Then 1% of 10 lakh is only for 1 year. It has to be multiplied by 5 if the tenure of the loan is 5 years. Or let's say my recipient is taking a loan only for 6 months. Then 1% divided by 2. So it will be simply 0.5 percentage. This per annum word is now inserted via amendment. Initially, this was not per annum. So what people used to do, simply on 10 lakh, 1% matter is over. Government is saying no. If the tenure of loan is 5 years, no, then 10 lakh into 1% into 5 you will have to do. So we are saying that this 1% has to be multiplied by the number of years for which the guarantee is offered. So 5 years, 5%. 6 months, 0.5%. So here we are simply saying, if ITC is eligible, no, then you forget everything. For entire Rule 28, this proviso remains common that if my recipient can take ITC, then though I will forget everything and whatever actually I am charging showing in the invoice, that only becomes my value of supply. If ITC is not available to my related person and I am providing a corporate guarantee, in that case, I will take 1% of guarantee amount per annum or what actual consideration I am charging to issue this corporate guarantee, whichever is higher will be taken as the value of supply. I will ask you 3-4 questions. You give me answer about what should be the value of supply. Let's assume ITC is not available to anyone in all the questions that I'm asking to you. That's a common assumption here that ITC is not eligible to anyone. Okay, ma'am. ABC gave guarantee to XYZ. Both are related person. Guarantee amount is, let's assume, 15 lakh. Loan amount is, let's assume, 20 lakh. And ABC actually charged some consideration to give this loan. let's say ABC Limited actually charged a consideration of 27,000 rupees. I asked 27,000 rupees from XYZ because I'm giving a loan to XYZ, so I can charge consideration for the same. Yes, ma'am. And the tenure of loan is, let's assume, 2 years. This is the total amount charged to give guarantee, and the loan tenure is 2 years. You tell me what is going to be the value of supply. Question 2, let's assume ABC gave a guarantee to PQR and they both are unrelated, ma'am. Guarantee amount 15 lakh, loan amount 20 lakh, and consideration 27,000. What should be the value of supply? Tenure here is 2 years only. Chalo. For these two questions, tell me what will be the value of supply for the corporate guarantee offered between one person to another person. Quickly. Chalo, ma'am. ITC not available. So I will simply take 1% of guarantee amount per annum, ma'am. So 15 lakh into 1% into 2 years comes as 30,000 versus actual consideration is only 27,000, ma'am. So whichever is higher, 30,000 is the value of supply. Everyone got it correct. What about question number 2? Ma'am, Rule 28 comes into picture when the supplier and recipient are related person. If they are unrelated, I will not apply Rule 28 only, no. For unrelated person, so whatever actual consideration you charge, that transaction value is only accepted as the value of supply. So 27,000 in itself is going to become the value of supply. Are you understanding, everyone? Say yes or no. Clear, ma'am. Now, one more point. The condition is that the company taking the loan, the recipient of corporate guarantee should be in India, which means the supplier of corporate guarantee can be outside India also. I have my related person outside India, possible. My related company outside India is giving me guarantee. Now, in this case, see, if Indian company gives guarantee to foreign company, no, Rule 28 will not apply. That will be qualified as export. Understand? I from India am giving services to a person outside India to take a loan. That will qualify as export, ma'am. And provisions for export are separate. But here I am saying my related person outside India is giving corporate guarantee to a company in India. In this case, we will say that this Rule 28 will apply. So you find out the value according to 1% and etc. whatever. But ma'am, we cannot tell this person outside India, no, to collect and pay GST to government. And we have already studied, ma'am, section 5(3) of IGST Act RCM entry, we had seen that if a person from non-taxable territory is giving any services to a person in taxable territory, then this person in taxable territory is required to pay reverse charge mechanism. So let us say in this question that I asked you, ABC is from outside India and XYZ is in India. The value of supply determined is 30,000. Now the company in India will be liable to pay GST on 30,000 under reverse charge mechanism because this now qualifies as an import of service. So here we are saying that if the guarantee is provided by foreign entity to a related entity in India, then RCM would apply. For domestic group of companies, normal FCM applies and invoice to be issued for the guarantee amount. But if there is an export, then so this provision cannot apply. No, why, ma'am? Because the condition is now inserted that the recipient has to be located in India only. Are you absolutely clear? This being an amendment has a very high chance to be asked in examination. Here we say, see normally. Let's say you are a very good student. You are a very, very, very good student giving all the answers in the class. You are a very good student giving all the answers in the class. Yes, Ayush. Then in that situation, I am sending you a pizza. Okay. Now, Ashish, as Ashish already said, ma'am, I am from Kolkata. I am from Maharashtra. Let's assume. Now, online only, using an e-commerce operator. What I did, I sent a pizza to Ashish. Who am I? A person from Maharashtra. Who is Ashish? who is going to receive the pizza. Now, of course, I will not order it on cash on delivery basis. That Ashish, pizza is from my side, but whenever it comes to your home, no, you make the payment. No, of course, I will prepay and send. Now, in that situation, I am the person who is billed. I will order it from my Riddhi Bagmar ID on Zomato. So I am being billed for the pizza. But where is the pizza actually going, ma'am? To Ashish. Is it also a kind of bill to ship to model? We can say yes, ma'am. But online it is happening via e-commerce operator. So what should be the place of supply? Maharashtra or Kolkata? Tell me. We are saying that particularly, see, it is all applicable for unregistered person again, because registered person would be mentioning the GST number. So let us say this is my business expense only. Sending pizza to students is considered, let's say, as my business expense, and I am registered. I give my GST number, then to it becomes business expense, and that's a separate thing. Then to my location is only place of supply. We are particularly talking about unregistered person here. So ma'am, unregistered person, let us say you are sending a pizza to your long distance boyfriend. You are sending a pizza to your long distance boyfriend prepaid, ma'am. So billing is done to us. Billing is done to us, but shipping is done somewhere else. In that situation, Kolkata is going to become the place of supply. Why, ma'am? Because that is the delivery address being mentioned. So we are saying that, ma'am, as you already said, that an unregistered person, whenever mentioning the address of consumption, that should only become the place of supply. So here also, ma'am, let's say I am unregistered. I ordered something not for myself. Now again, I gave address of some third person only, ordering for them or for them. In that situation, ma'am, we are saying that particularly when the goods are supplied through any e-commerce platform to unregistered person, billing address is different from delivery address, then the delivery address is going to become the place of supply. Supplier may record delivery address as the address of recipient on invoice for the purpose of determination of place of supply. Tell me, are you understanding? Are you getting this? Yes or yes? Section 13.8 particularly talks about, they have notified 3 services here. In section 13.8, they are talking particularly about 3 services. They are saying that for these 3 services, if supplier or recipient is outside India, whatever is the location of supplier, you take that as the place of supply. Particularly for 3 services, government is saying that wherever is supplier, you take that location as place of supply. But do not forget, this applies only when either supplier or recipient is outside India. Students generally mix everything. The reason I teach you section 12 completely separately, revise it 2-3 times, and then we go to section 13 is you don't start mixing up things. Like section 12 also you have banking services. Section 13 also you have banking services. But the provisions are different. So keep 12 separate and keep 13 separate. Okay, ma'am. So what are these 3 services for which always, ma'am, always place of supply will be supplier's location only. So here we say, ma'am, first, services by banking, NBFC, financial institutions, etc. to their own account holders. Ma'am, this is very particular and very specific. Understand. We are providing services to our own account holders, that too excluding current account holders. Which means, ma'am, if a bank outside India is providing services to a person in India, or a bank in India is providing services to a person outside India, okay, both situations can be covered, right, ma'am? And if the account holder is a current account holder, then, ma'am, then general provision of section 13.2 will apply. If recipient's location available, take that. Not available, supplier. So, ma'am, for current account, the general provision of 13.2 will only apply. Okay, ma'am. So, ma'am, if current account are excluded, what could be normally possible account holders here, ma'am? See, NRE accounts, NRO accounts, right? People outside India opening account here, people in India opening account there, where the either bank or customer, someone is outside India, ma'am. In that situation, we are saying, wherever the bank actually is, the supplier actually is, that should become the place of supply. See, generally we always take recipient's location to be the place of supply. 13.8 is one good exception, saying that we will take supplier's location as the place of supply, because consumption mostly is happening there here. So we will say that, ma'am, if services are provided to our own account holder, that to other than current account holder, ma'am. For current account holder, again general provision will apply. Other than current account holder, ma'am, wherever the bank or financial institution is, that place only becomes the place of supply. Examples could be NRE account, NRO account, etc. Ma'am, what if bank can provide services to other people also who are not our account holder? Then what to do in that situation? So let's say if services are provided to any other person who is not the account holder of the bank, then again 13.2 will apply. So this 13.8 is very particular and very specific, saying that bank, NBFC, financial institution providing services to only own account holder, that too other than current account holder. Which means, ma'am, if someone is not account holder or someone is current account holder, then always general 13.2 will apply. Tell me, is it clear till here? Then we discuss the amendment portion. Is it clear till here that, ma'am, there are three services we are discussing as of now? Point number one, for three services, always supplier's location will be the place of supply. For three services, always supplier's location will be the place of supply. Ma'am, when bank is providing services to own account holder, that too excluding current account holder. So, ma'am, people other than own account holder or current account holders, the general provision of 13.2 will apply. Right, ma'am. Now understand custodial services provided by bank to foreign portfolio investment. What is FPI? Can anyone tell me? There are two terms, FDI and FPI, if you have heard about them. Who are these FDI and FPI people? Who are these FDIs and FPI people? Can you tell me, are you aware about it? Ma'am, foreign direct investment people, let us say companies outside India are coming to India, establishing factories here, investing in infrastructure, etc. They are directly investing in the economy of the country. They are FDIs. But ma'am, FPIs are, they are not directly investing here. They are purchasing shares of Indian companies. So money ultimately is coming to Indian companies and then they use it. But they are not directly investing, right? So these people are FPI peoples who purchase shares, securities, bonds, etc. of the Indian companies, right? They are FPIs. So now what happens generally? These people do not keep a personal track of everything. So let us say if they are purchasing some bonds or shares or securities, they take custodial services from banks. Ma'am, what do we mean by custodial services? They will simply tell the banks that we have purchased this shares, stock, bond, debenture. So whenever dividend comes on this, whenever interest comes on this, you take care of it, you do everything. So basically taking care of these shares, stock, bond, debentures or investments that these people have done, they provide this responsibility to banks. These are known as custodial services. Now here also understand, bank is in India. Let's say these people are outside India, but still section 13.8 will not apply because these people are not account holders of banks. You understand, their intention is not to take banking services as account holder from bank. Their intention is to take custodial services from bank. So again, for government has clearly clarified this thing in amendment now, that if a bank is providing any custodial services for safekeeping their securities and other incidental services that had to be carried out, let's say to receive dividend, to receive interest, etc., you can also give instructions that if this amount goes beyond this, you please sell it. If it goes below this, you purchase it, or whatever. These kind of services, custodial services provided by bank to foreign portfolio investors, we will say 13.2 only generally will apply. Why? Because these people are not the account holders of the bank. Their intention is not to take banking services from the bank being customers. Their intention is to take custodial services, which becomes a general service, and therefore general provision should apply. Say yes, ma'am. Did you understand the proviso? Say yes. Ma'am, services by banking company to own account holder other than current account holder, generally where the supplier, where the bank is, that becomes place of supply. But ma'am, custodial services are not banking services, so these people are not account holders, so their general provision of 13.2 will apply. Then we talk about intermediary services in relation to goods, services or securities. Ma'am, what do you understand by the term intermediary services here? See, agent and intermediary services are two different things. I have given a little hint here also. Only for understanding purpose. Only for understanding purpose, understand that the intermediary under section 13.8 is not same as agent under section schedule 1. See, in agent we had this condition that invoice should be issued in the name of agent only. Then only agent is considered as agent under GST. But ma'am, section 13.8 is talking about a pure intermediary person who is not issuing invoices in own name. I repeat again, the intermediary under 13.8 is not same as agent under schedule 1. We always wanted the agent to issue invoices in own name, but we don't want the intermediary to issue invoice in own name. Intermediary simply means the person who is arranging or facilitating the supply between original supplier and original recipient. I am simply a supportive person in between. Let me teach you this example only along with section 13.8. This is a new amendment inserted and it is completely related to section 13.8. So see, advertising services provided to foreign clients. Okay. So let's say today a foreign company comes to India, starts to do their business. Of course, they are unaware about the choice, taste, preferences of Indian people, what kind of advertisements do they prefer. So what happens is this foreign client enters into a contract with an advertising agency in India. The foreign client enters into purely advertising agency services in India. Right? Now, what will happen? The foreign client will give them the budget. This is the budget of our advertisement. This is the product, and this is how we are thinking to advertise it. Now, the decision of when to give the ad on TV, when to give the ad on Instagram, when to give the ad in newspaper, how to put ads on hoardings and everything is decided by this advertising agency. Why? Because this advertising agency in India knows about how people would like the advertisements, what current trends are going on, what current memes are being viral on Instagram, so they can use all that and do advertisement. So simply what happens is the foreign client completely outsources entire activity of advertising to Indian agency. Everything like deciding the media planning, whether our advertisement should be given on Star Plus channel or should it be given on some news channel. So understand, let us say the foreign company that is coming to India is selling some makeup products or selling some products which are normally more related to the female category. This advertising agency might take a decision to show these ads between TV serials, daily soap serials, because normally housewives or women tend to see those serials more, right? So now this ad could be possibly run on Star Plus or some other shows. Now this person would be aware, no, Indian advertising agency, not the foreign client. But let us say the advertisement is with respect to some software that can be used in office, etc. Then they might decide to give ad on Z Business or CNBC or some news channel, right? So everything like planning, which media, investment, designing, content, procuring space, everything is done by the advertising agency only. So what happens is, let's say the advertising agency will simply issue an invoice of, let's assume, 10 crore rupees to this foreign client as my complete invoice for all the advertisement that I will carry out. Now this advertising agency takes various advertisement from various media owners. So let's say Star Plus, Z Business, Instagram, newspaper, hoardings or magazines or various other people who can do advertisement for me. Now these media owners will be issuing invoices in the name of advertising agency only. Advertising agencies itself going, taking invoices in own name from the media owner and then doing complete advertisements. So not at a single time this media owner is related to foreign client. No ma'am. Foreign client is related to advertising agency. Advertising agency is related to the media owner. So here you cannot consider advertising agency as an intermediary. No, section 13.8 will not be applicable. As I told you, intermediary under 13.8 is not the same as agent under schedule 1. Here we don't want invoice to be issued in own name. Why, ma'am? Because we simply want the person to be a supportive person. That is what intermediary means. Now here this is not a supportive person. This is the main person stepping in between, started issuing invoices on own name, which means ma'am 13.8 cannot be applicable. I cannot consider this advertising agency to be an intermediary between foreign client and media owner. Not at all, ma'am. He is not an intermediary. In fact, he is the main supplier here and he is the main recipient here. So I will say that no involvement of goods physically also required. This is not even a performance based services, because I simply have to do advertisement. This is not even performance based service. This is not even intermediary type of service. Simply the foreign client is liable to pay consideration. There it becomes recipient of advertisement services. And advertisement services is a general service, should be falling under general provisions. And therefore we say section 13 to the general provision will only apply. And ma'am, according to general provision, we are saying, according to general provision, we are saying that, ma'am, the advertising agency is in India, recipient is outside India. Let's say if forex is received, place of supply, to anyways 13.2 recipient's location foreign would only become the place of supply. If all conditions are satisfied, we can also take the benefit of export here. So we are saying that the foreign client is liable to pay consideration, so it becomes the recipient, provided by advertising agency. Now, any representative of foreign client in India, including any subsidiary or related person, simply interaction is happening. See, understand, this foreign client is not personally present in India. He can appoint someone, some agent or representative, to simply see whether this advertising agency is properly doing its work or not. In that case also, these guys don't become the recipient. No, recipient still remains foreign client only. Or the target audience are also not the recipient. They are the people seeing the advertisement. So simply, purely, ma'am, this is supplier, this is recipient. Advertising agency is the supplier providing advertising services to foreign client, and advertising services are not any exceptional point, ma'am, general provision. Therefore 13.2 should apply. And if all goods good, forex is received, they are not mere establishment of distinct person, place of supply outside India, recipient outside India, supplier in India, I can also qualify this as export of service. Are you understanding? Yes, ma'am. On the opposite hand, let us say the media owner directly invoices the foreign client. Now, what happened? I am straight away, as a foreign company, receiving my invoice from Star Plus channel only. I am straight away simply receiving the invoice from Star Plus channel only. The advertising person was just acting as an intermediary. He just arranged a contract between foreign client and media owner. This guy just arranged a contract and took money for such arrangement separately. He is not invoicing for the total supply. In that case, we can consider, the advertising agency as an intermediary, and their section 13.8 will apply. And now, who is supplier, ma'am? Advertising agency. So his location in India would become the place of supply. Are you understanding, everyone? Say yes, ma'am. So the agent under Schedule 1 and intermediary under 13.8 are completely two different category items. Ma'am, here we wanted invoice to be in own name. Here we don't want invoice to be in own name. Intermediary is simply a person who is issuing invoice simply for his intermediary charges, that is all. He is not at all involved in the original supply of goods or services. He is just acting as a supportive person. He is not taking or supplying goods, services or securities on own account. He is making supplier and recipient meet and simply taking his commission. Now, for simply taking his commission, that commission service, we say whatever is the intermediary's location, that becomes the place of supply. Did you understand? Say yes, ma'am. One more amendment inserted, again related to section 13.8 only. Let us understand this also. So, ma'am, section 13.8 says that whenever intermediary services are provided, location of supplier becomes place of supply. But who is intermediary, man? Simply acting as a supportive person. So, data hosting services provided by service providers in India to cloud computing service providers outside India. So, what happens is, recipients, let us say cloud computing service providers, they normally have a lot of data, right? Let's say they are providing cloud computing services to end users or subscribers. Now they need to store a large amount of data on servers, etc., and they need to take care of everything. So normally what these suppliers, data hosting service providers, do is they provide data hosting services to securely store and manage large amount of information. So basically, these data hosting service providers, they either own data center or operate on leased premises, and they handle everything like rent, power, infrastructure, security of the servers where the data is stored, and everything is done by these data hosting service providers to customers who are actually providing cloud computing services to some another people. Now here understand, what will happen is this data hosting service provider will simply send an invoice to the cloud computing service provider only for securely storing the data, right? There is no contract between these data hosting people and end subscriber. I am though not even aware about, not even having an idea about who are the end subscribers or users to whom this cloud computing service provider is providing cloud computing services, ma'am. No idea at all. I am simply data hosting service provider is simply providing the services of hosting the data, map. So here we will say there is no contract between the data hosting person and end customer. I am, as a data hosting person, is providing services simply to the cloud computing person on principal to principal basis on own account. Therefore, can you consider this person as an intermediary between this and this guy? Is it like the data hosting service provider is an intermediary between cloud computing person and end user? No, ma'am. Cloud computing person is himself only providing services to end users, ma'am. I am not even concerned somewhere. I am just providing a supporting service. That is all. So we say place of supply will be determined according to the general provision of 13.2 only. It can qualify as export only. This is not an intermediary. Understand? I am not, as a data hosting person, I am not connecting supplier and recipient. No, not at all. Supplier and recipient are connected on their own only. I am just providing a service to particularly this person. I am least concerned about the end users. So, of course, I am not an intermediary. And plus, you cannot consider these services in relation to an immovable property. You cannot say you have not taken that space on rent. See, understand, if this is a place where all my data etc is stored, I have not taken this place on rent. I am least concerned about the place. I am concerned about the safety, security, infrastructure of my data. So basically the service that I want to take is data hosting service and not the immovable property renting service. Therefore, 13.4 will also not apply. 13.8 will also not apply because it is not even a case of intermediary. So again, general provision of 13.2 will only apply. And again, the location of recipient becomes the place of supply. And this also can be considered as export under GST. Tell me, is it clear, everyone? Say yes. These two amendments are newly inserted, high chances of being asked in examination. Intermediary means, ma'am, a person who is making supplier and recipient meet, charging some cut commission out of the original supply of goods, service or securities happening. That person is an intermediary person, ma'am. And for that section 13.8 applies that whatever is the location of supplier intermediary, that becomes the place of supply. If you start issuing invoices in your own name, ma'am, then you check the underlying supply only, because now you have either supplied or provide or received that actual supply issued invoice. Then, ma'am, again 13.2 will come into picture and not 13.8. Again here, ma'am, I am simply a person providing some extra services to supplier. I am not at all bothered about recipient. I am not charging any commission, etc. So again, I cannot be considered as an intermediary. So 13.8 will not apply in both the cases. This is what clarification government inserted, that section 13.8 will not apply in both the cases. Hence, you go by the general provisions only. Otherwise, ma'am, can you then give some examples for intermediary? Yes, understand. Mr. John wants to sell some goods in India. He is not aware about who can purchase his goods. He contacted me. I actually arranged people who could actually purchase his goods. Then I made the recipients and supplier meet and I charged commission from Mr. John because I acted as an intermediary to sell his goods. I did not invoice goods in my own name to the customer. I simply took a commission. John only gave the invoice to Geeta Raju in India. In that case, ma'am, I am an intermediary and I am a supplier providing intermediary services to Mr. John, who is outside India. Me being the supplier in India, my location becomes the place of supply. Are you understanding, everyone? Yes, ma'am. Clear. And then section 16.4 talks about, ma'am, is there any last date to avail ITC for any particular debit note or any particular invoice? Yes, of course. We are saying for whichever period or whichever financial year your debit note or invoice pertains to, after the end of that financial year, 30 November or actual date of filing annual return, whichever is earlier is the last date till where you can avail ITC. This is the same last date as of credit note only. So last date for taking ITC in respect of invoices or debit note is 30 November or actual date of filing annual return, whichever is earlier. So if I have mistakenly missed on any invoice or debit note and I forgot to take ITC and this period is gone, then I cannot take ITC of the same ever in my life. Done? We have studied something known as self-invoicing, right, in tax invoice chapter, that when a registered person is receiving some goods or services from an unregistered person and according to section 9.3 or 9.4 that person has to issue a self-invoice, then ma'am, then we are saying that this period of 30 November and actual date of filing annual return, you should check according to the date of your self-invoice only. Normally always supplier issues invoice. So whatever is the date of invoice or debit note issued by supplier to which financial year it pertains, I will see after the end of financial year, 30 November, actual date of filing annual return, whichever is earlier. But we are saying that when the recipient is issuing invoice of RCM supplies received from unregistered person, the relevant financial year for calculation under section 16.4 will be the financial year in which such invoice is actually issued, subject to payment of tax and other conditions. Now see, understand, let us say I availed RCM supply from a URP. I availed RCM supply from a URP. I made payment also. I received the goods also. Everything was okay. Time of supply had arrived. I should have ideally issued invoice on, let us say I should have ideally issued invoice on 30 March only. 30 March 2024 is the date on which I should have ideally issued this self invoice for a particular RCM supply that I have received. But I actually issued it on 3rd April 2024. My financial year changes, yes ma'am. Now we are saying actual section 16.4 condition, you will check when you actually issued this invoice. So I actually issued on 3rd April 24 only, which means this was FY 23-24. This is FY 24-25. So now my last date to take ITC for this particular self invoice that I have issued is 30 November 2025 or actual date of filing annual return, whichever is earlier. We are saying that if we are issuing late self invoice also, then also I will calculate my last date from the date when I am only actually issuing the self invoice. But penalties etc., other penalties, interest etc. can apply because of invoice issuing late. That's a separate thing. See, if I am issuing invoice after time of supply, if I am issuing the invoice after time of supply for any RCM inward supply, they are saying ITC applicability for section 16.4, you check according to original self invoice date only. But because you are now issuing the self invoice late, for that reason, yes, under section 122, we can levy penalties on you also and we can levy interest etc. on you also. Are you understanding? Say yes ma'am. So we are saying that if a self invoice is issued late after time of supply, it will not hamper the ITC availability. For ITC availability, you can still according to your original date of issuing that late invoice only calculate this last date and then take ITC. But of course there has to be some punishment for you if you are issuing late invoices, late self invoices. That some punishment is interests will be applicable and penalties also will be applicable, that we will see later on. Is it making sense? Say yes. Say yes ma'am. Awaiting replies guys. Section 16.1 eligibility. I have to be a registered person plus whatever I am purchasing is in course furtherance of business. Section 16.2 conditions. I should have invoice, supplier furnishing GSTR 1, received goods services, not restricted, GST paid, and I have to file my GSTR 3B. 16.3, if on the GST component, I take depreciation, I cannot take ITC. But if I don't take depreciation, I can take ITC only on the GST component, not talking about the entire taxable value. 16.4, of course, there is a last date for an invoice. You cannot take ITC after 10 years also. So it is simply 30 November or actual date of filing annual return, whichever is earlier, till when you should ideally take the ITC, otherwise it will not be allowed. For cases of RCM inward supplies from URP, when you actually do self-invoicing, even if you are doing late self-invoicing from your late date only, this period has to be seen. But then there will be some other additional penalties, interest, etc. leviable on you because you are issuing late self-invoicing. Right, ma'am. Section 16.5 is also inserted by government this time, but it is not applicable for your syllabus. It is kind of a temporary provision. I can say that for some years government extended some due dates etc. to avail ITC. So this is all a temporary situation. Therefore, ICAI has not made section 16.5 applicable in the syllabus. Now the last amendment or the last new section added. Earlier till last attempt there were only provisions till section 16.4. So section 16 had only 4 subsections till last attempt, but now section 16 is having 6 subsections, but 16.5 is not applicable to you. Straight away moving to section 16.6, let's understand what is it saying, because its amendment automatically becomes important for you also. Yes, ma'am. Section 16.6, where registration, listen to me carefully, very simple, you'll understand it in one go only. But it's important, of course, because it's amended. So where registration of a registered person is cancelled under section 29. What is section 29, ma'am? Cancellation of registration. So if your registration is cancelled under section 29 for any reason and subsequently it is revoked under section 30, or by an order of a court or tribunal, or for any reason your cancelled registration is now revoked. Okay, ma'am. And where availment of ITC in respect of an invoice or debit note was not restricted under section 16.4 on the date of order of cancellation, the said person shall be entitled to take ITC for such invoice in return under section 39. This is the due date according to 16.4, or for the period from cancellation till revocation, where return is filed within 30 days from the date of from the order of revocation. Ma'am, can you please explain this? Yes, now listen to me very carefully what they are saying. Let us say my registration got cancelled. My registration got cancelled on 30, or let us say 3 June 2025, my registration got cancelled. Now once you are cancelled, can you after cancellation take any ITC or file any return or anything? Tell me. See, ma'am, whatever happened prior to cancellation, whatever supplies I have made prior to cancellation, I can still file the returns for the same after my cancellation period. That is not a problem at all. So if I have not filed any return prior to when I was cancelled, that's not a problem. I can still file those returns and show my supplies and ITCs, etc. That is okay, not a problem. But ma'am, let us say my cancellation got revoked ultimately on, let's say, 10 September 2025, my cancellation got revoked. So this revocation is applicable from the original date when you were cancelled only. So it's not like you are first registered, then cancelled for 3 months and then again registered. No, it doesn't work that way. We have understood also that for this period, then later you have to issue revised tax invoices also, because you are considered as registered only. Say yes, ma'am, makes sense. Say yes, ma'am, makes sense. Are you understanding? Quickly give me a thumbs up that yes, ma'am. If I am cancelled on a particular date and then I am revoked on a later date, which could be anything. So let's say the case went very long and my registration got revoked in the same year or in the next year, etc. Right, ma'am. But now for this entire period, I will be later on considered as registered only. I will have to issue revised tax invoices also within 30 days. But what about ITC? The question here is, what about ITC? Let us say on the date of cancellation, there was some purchases, ITC of which was eligible as on that date, or let us say I purchased something here. If I was able to file my GSTR 3B on that date, I would have taken ITC. But now let us say because my registration got revoked in 2026, according to that financial year, my due date to take ITC is over. Let's assume this is 2027. The case was going in the court for 2 years, and now ultimately in 2027 they are revoking my cancellation. So ma'am, if I made a purchase here, my last date to avail ITC would be 30 November somewhere in 2025 or 26, which is already gone. Now what to do? If government would have allowed me to file returns at that point of time, I would have taken ITC for the same. No. So we are saying that for the period from cancellation till revocation, I could have taken ITC at that point of time. But because they did not allow me to take ITC at that point of time, now government is giving some extended time to you, saying that, see, this is the normal time limit, right? So up to 30 November following the end of financial year for which the debit note invoice pertains, or the date of annual return, whichever is earlier, this due date is to there only. If your revocation happens, let's say within 1 or 2 months only, so this original date is to there with you only, which is later. Or if your revocation is happening very late and this date is already gone, we give you 30 more days. So the day on which your revocation of cancellation is done, within 30 days from here, you can quickly go. So whichever is later, either the original time limit according to 16(4), or we are saying that after revocation, within 30 days for all these periods where you could have taken ITC if you were not cancelled, we give you 30 days to quickly run and take ITC of the same. Say yes ma'am, we are understanding. Say yes ma'am, we are understanding. So we are saying that all these ITCs were not restricted actually as on the date of order of cancellation. All these ITCs were not restricted as on the date of order of cancellation, but I got cancelled eventually. So now what to do? Nothing. You have the original time limit with you. You respect that. If that is later, then to no problem, only till that date I am eligible as such. But if that time limit is over, what to do ma'am? No problem. After revocation, we are giving you 30 more days to take all the ITCs. Whichever is later, you can take the benefit and take all the ITCs. Because it is very much fair also, no? If you tell us to issue revised tax invoices and pay taxes for that entire period, you should be giving us ITCs also for that entire period. Yes ma'am, understood. Yes Karim. There's a first return also that you file for showing revised tax invoices, etc. Then talking about input tax credit in respect of demo vehicles for transportation of passengers seating capacity less than equal to 13. Now, under section 17(5). Under section 17(5), which is blocked credit, the very first point that we understood was for any motor vehicle designed to carry passengers, and if seating capacity including driver is up to 13, then ITC in GST is blocked. Right ma'am. But here we are particularly talking about demo vehicles. So we are saying that to promote the sales of similar type of motor vehicles, we are purchasing a demo vehicle. Then let's say a dealer purchases a demo vehicle so that he can show that demo vehicle to the customers, give them test rides, etc., and so that customers can purchase cars. So here we are saying that this is actually related to my further supply of selling the cars. I am not selling that demo vehicle as it is, but I am using that demo vehicle to sell the other cars which are similar to that demo vehicle. Yes, you can consider it for the purpose of furtherance of business only, and therefore we are saying that GST will not be blocked here. So demo vehicles promote sale of similar type of motor vehicles. They can be considered to be used by dealer for further supply of motor vehicle only, and accordingly ITC will not be blocked under section 17(5). Makes sense. So if a dealer is purchasing a demo vehicle, using it to sell further other cars, ITC will not be blocked. ITC will be available to this kind of a dealer. However, sometimes the authorized dealers merely act as agents only or service providers only, which means they themselves on their own account do not sell any vehicle further to any people. They simply have a demo vehicle which they purchase to give people marketing services or test drive facilities, etc. And then whenever the actual sales happen, the billing is done by the original company only, and these people simply charge a commission. So here we are saying that this person himself is not engaged in the further supply of such vehicles, and therefore ITC for this kind of a person acting as agent or service provider is going to be blocked. Okay, ma'am. So now we are saying that cases where the authorized dealer merely acts as an agent or service provider to vehicle manufacturer for providing marketing service including test drive facility on behalf of manufacturer. I am not directly involved in sale or purchase of vehicle. The dealer only purchases demo vehicle from manufacturer only for providing marketing facilitation service and not to make the supply of vehicle. I purchased this demo vehicle only to do marketing and only to give test drive to people and only to promote the sales of that vehicle, because I get a very good commission, but I on my own name do not invoice this vehicle. So I am not involved in the further supply of this demo vehicle. And now we are saying that this car is a normal asset for business, just like if I'm in a business of furniture, I still might purchase a car used for my business purpose, but still ITC is blocked for me. Similarly, this person is not selling cars, this person is selling services for which he is receiving commission or agency charges. So for him also, because the vehicle is not supplied on own account, ITC will be blocked under section 17(5). So availability of ITC on demo vehicle is not affected by capitalization. So if you are capitalizing the car or if you are not capitalizing the car, does not affect at all, because motor vehicle is a separate block given. If you are, see, in immovable property we had seen under section 17(5) that if you are constructing an immovable property, and if you are capitalizing it, then ITC is blocked. If you are not capitalizing it, in that case for construction, repair, renovation, etc., ITC is available, which is not the case for motor vehicle. You decide to expense off your entire motor vehicle or you decide to capitalize your entire motor vehicle. Motor vehicle in itself is a separate blocked credit entry given in the law. So to summarize everything, what we are simply saying is that if I am myself involved in further supply of cars only and I purchase a demo vehicle, I am in that business only. I might not sell that demo vehicle, but I am selling similar vehicles to other people, ITC will be available to me. But if I am a person only receiving commission and agency charges from the manufacturer, from the company, and I purchase a demo vehicle to promote the sales of that car, in that case ITC for me is going to be blocked, because I am not engaged in the business of selling cars. Is it clear? Say yes, ma'am. Section 17(5) first point says that ITC for motor vehicle seating capacity less than equal to 13, ITC is blocked. So here we are saying, what about demo vehicle? If I am in the business of further selling cars only, then available, but I am not in the business of selling cars, I simply charge commission and the billing is done by the original manufacturer only, then ITC for me is going to be blocked. Very simple in a gist. Again, ITC in respect of duct manholes used in network of optical fiber cables. Now understand. In section 17(5) again, we saw that construction of immovable property, ITC is blocked. Plant machine, it is available. But there were three things which are never considered as plant machine. What were those three things, ma'am? Entire land building or a civil structure. You cannot consider entire land building civil structure as plant machine, or telecommunication tower, or pipeline outside the factory. Now here what they have clarified is, if there are duct or manholes used. What is a manhole or a duct, ma'am? So to lay the optical fibers, this size of pipes are laid below the sand level so that entire person can walk into that duct or a manhole. If you have seen that movie, Happy New Year, If you've seen Happy New Year, in the ending scene, Sonu Sood is in the pipe only, no, changing that valve, etc., to fill water in that tank, right? So that is known as a manhole or a duct. Just to lay optical fibers, if we are laying those entire manholes or ducts, you cannot consider them as pipelines or land building or civil structure or telecommunication tower, and therefore don't block the ITC under section 17(5). So particularly if we are laying optical fiber cables, etc., we have to make such big ducts and manholes, and they are actually a part of plant machine only, and therefore you should not be blocking ITC and you should be making ITC available. So it's just a simple clarification or a notification saying that we don't want to block ITC for ducts and manholes used in network of optical fiber cables. So not blocked under 17(5), as these are considered as plant machine, not categorized as land building, civil structure, telecommunication tower or pipeline outside the factory. Do we understand this? Say yes, ma'am. See, normally what happens is very big businessmen like Ambanis and Adanis, and they have good contacts with government, right? So whatever becomes blocked for them, no, what they can do is have some contacts with the bigger people who make provisions for them. So tell me, who is in the business of optical fiber cables, for whom pipeline outside the factory might have got blocked? No. So government straight away issued a notification saying that anyone, now who is that anyone? We all know, right? So anyone working in the business of optical fiber cables, if they are laying full manholes or ducts, ITC will be allowed to them. Entitlement of ITC by insurance company on expenses incurred for repair of motor vehicle in case of reimbursement mode of insurance claim settlement. Now see, understand. Let's say there is a car. Rabia is the owner of this car. When the car was purchased by Rabia, ITC was blocked because, of course, motor vehicle designed to carry passengers less than 13 seating capacity. Right. Rabia got this car insured, and later on the car met with an accident. She went to the insurance company. Insurance company got the car repaired. This is the garage owner, let us say, who repaired the car, issued the invoice to insurance company. Insurance company paid the amount to the garage owner, and ultimately everything is settled off. Now you tell me, will the insurance company be eligible to claim ITC, yes or no? I have already taught you this point. Will the insurance company be eligible to take ITC, say yes or no? Ma'am, see here in section 17(5) only, you had taught this to us particularly, that ITC for manufacturer of the motor vehicles or insurance company, if they are incurring any insurance service repair maintenance expenses, then ITC is allowed to them. Okay. But this is when they get it repaired on their own. Now the question here is, what about reimbursement mode of insurance settlement? What is reimbursement mode, ma'am? Reimbursement mode means first Rabia will pay the amount to the garage person, and then insurance company will reimburse the amount later on to Rabia. Now what to do, ma'am? Insurance company is not directly paying the repair amount to the technician of the car. This amount is now paid to Rabia. Now what will happen for ITC of insurance company? So here we say, see, the garage issues invoice in the name of insurance company. Now what practically happens is, even if Rabia is making the payment for this kind of repairs, she will tell the garage owner to issue the invoice in the name of insurance company only. Now because the garage owner will not wait for insurance company to release the claim and then receive the amount. They are not giving any credit facility to the insurance company. So therefore the garage owner will straight away be charging the amount from Rabia only. So what will happen is that the policy holder or the insured will make the payment of such repair to the garage person, and later on this expenses will be reimbursed by insurance company when the claim is approved to the insured. No problem, because ultimately the invoice is in the name of insurance company only. Therefore, insurance company will be eligible to take ITC on such repair expenses. Ma'am, what if invoice amount is greater than approved claim? The repair expenses incurred actually are 5 lakh rupees. But according to my policy, According to my insurance policy, I am reimbursed only with 3 lakh rupees. So of course, insurance company will be eligible to take proportionate ITC and not of the full invoice ITC. That is so very simple and clear. So if the amount is greater than approved claim, then ITC will be available only to extent of reimbursement that insurance company is doing and not the full invoice amount. But let us say, ma'am, initially the garage owner issued invoice in the name of Rabia only for repairs and not in the name of insurance company. Then even if insurance company is reimbursing this amount to Rabia, because section 16(2)(a) says that to claim any ITC, you should be in a possession of invoice or any valid tax paying document, which the insurance company is not, and therefore it is violating section 16 and ITC cannot be taken. So if the invoice is not issued in the name of insurance company, ITC will not be available because no invoice, no ITC. See, this is all a problem in reimbursement mode, right? In the cashless mode of settlement of insurance company, so we know that amount is directly paid by insurance company to the garage. So this difficulty does not arise only because insurance company pays the amount to the garage gives the invoice to the insurance company, that's all sorted, insurance company can take ITC. We are discussing about the reimbursement mode. Now in reimbursement mode, we are saying that if invoice is in the name of insurance company only, later on it is reimbursing, ITC can be taken. If it is not in the name of insurance company, then ITC cannot be taken. If it is in the name of insurance company, but the amount of invoice is more than the claim approved, then only ITC proportionate to the claim approved will be available to the insurance company and not the full ITC. Tell me yes, ma'am. Absolutely clear. Done. Ma'am, if I am not happy with the order of appellate authority or I am not happy with the order of revisional authority, what to do? Now we will go to appellate tribunal. We've seen the hierarchy. The hierarchy says that adjudicating authority to appellate authority. Now there's one more authority here, which is revisional authority. Only for department we are saying that if department was unable to file the appeal within 6 months to appellate authority, they have this one extra power of revision which they can utilize. Now, if I am not happy and I am aggrieved either from the order of appellate authority or from the order of revisional authority, what I can do? Now I will go to appellate tribunal. Now I will go to appellate tribunal. Chalo. Majorly all the procedures are also same here. See, either department can also go and file appeal. Time limit again is 6 months, no extension, no pre-deposit. Pure 6 months time department is given. If assessee wants to file an appeal, 3 months time plus 3 months extension is there. We have to file electronically. See, earlier the amendment to file electronically was only for appellate authority, but now for appellate tribunal also they have inserted this, that all the applications are required to be filed electronically only. Manually could be allowed only if, let's say, the order is not available or if the registrar allows. Provisional acknowledgement, final acknowledgement, everything same. If you are filing manually, provisional acknowledgement would be given to you immediately within 7 days. You give the copy, then final acknowledgement. After 7 days, if you give, then the date of giving becomes your effective date of filing appeal. Electronically, in case though, the provisional date only is the final date. So everything same procedure that we have studied in section 107 will be applicable. Everything. I have mentioned this amendment only here, but remember, if assessee is required to file electronically, department is also required to file electronically, plus there is memorandum of cross objection which also requires to be filed electronically only. Ma'am, what is memorandum of cross objection? So let us say assessee went to appellate tribunal. Of course, the appellate tribunal would be telling the department to cross object whatever matter I am appealing. Of course, department will tell them, no, what is your say on this? You please give us in writing. Or if department is appealing, I will give at least some answer against them. That is known as memorandum of cross objection. This also is required to be filed electronically only. In all the cases, if registrar is allowing, then you can file it manually, otherwise no. Okay, time limit to file memorandum of cross objection would be 45 days plus 45 days. So the day on which one of the person makes appeal, the opposite person has 45 plus 45 days time to provide the authority with the cross objection memorandum. This is all not that important. Okay, procedure part. Remember, according to amendment, everything needs to be filed electronically. Registrar may allow manual filing. Okay, pre-deposit becomes exactly double. So in case of appellate authority, What was the pre-deposit? 10% or maximum 25 crore of disputed tax. Admitted amount to anyways 100% you have to pay. So admitted amount to everywhere 100% you have to pay only. Here of the disputed tax, the pre-deposit becomes double. Now it is 20% of tax or maximum 50 crore. Remember, this is CGST Act, so same to same pre-deposit will also be payable under SGST Act. This is in addition to the amount that you have already deposited to the appellate authority. Right, ma'am. If I win the case again, refund will be given to me along with 9% per annum interest from the date of deposit till the date of payment. There was no fees required to be paid when you are going to appellate authority. But now when you are going to appellate tribunal, you have to pay a fees also. What fees, ma'am? For every 1 lakh of tax or ITC that I am disputing, 1000 rupees. So till 25 lakh to 25,000 maximum, let's say I am disputing 50 lakh, then I will not be required to pay 50,000. Maximum is going to be 25,000 only. What are you understanding? Fees is 1000 for every 1 lakh. Fees is 1000 for every 1 lakh of tax or ITC involved, but maximum it can go till 25,000 only, which means if the disputed amount is 25 lakh, then the maximum fees is 25,000. If disputed amount is more than 25 lakh, then also maximum fees payable is going to be 25,000 only. Right, ma'am? Understood. So nothing very tough here. There was no fees when I go to adjudicating authority, but I have to pay an additional fees when I go to appellate tribunal. Also understand, this fees is exempt, not taxable under GST. Why, ma'am? Because we have studied FB changes. And do you remember FB changes? Services of funeral, mortuary burial, bond to bond transfer, court, tribunal. Any fees that you are paying to court or tribunal according to Schedule 3, no GST is applicable on this fees. So only fees you have to pay, no GST on this fees, again according to Schedule 3. Right, ma'am? So time limit 3 months plus 3 months electronically I have to file. Everything has to be filed electronically only. If registrar allows, then manual filing would be possible. Provisional acknowledgement, final acknowledgement, everything same as the appellate authority point only. Fees you have to pay plus pre-deposit will be double of what we were paying to appellate authority. Right, ma'am. If this pre-deposit has to be refunded anytime, it will be along with 9% per annum interest. Earlier, withdrawal point was only there for appellate authority. Now, the same to same point is also inserted for appellate tribunal. So, again, anytime before my appellate tribunal issues any order, I can anytime withdraw. I can anytime withdraw my case that I have filed. Again, same to same thing. If final acknowledgement is issued, I will be requiring approval before withdrawal, decided within 15 days. There's only one difference. When I am doing withdrawal in case of appellate authority, they have to allow me withdrawal within 7 days of my application. But when I go to appellate tribunal, tribunal is comparatively busier than appellate authority, we assume. So government is giving them 15 days time to approve withdrawal of a person. Again, if I have to file fresh appeal, everything remains same. I have to comply with the original time limit. So withdrawal is ditto same to same as the withdrawal that we studied for appellate authority. The only difference is, if final acknowledgement is issued, I have to take permission. That permission there is given within 7 days, but here it is given within 15 days. Say yes, ma'am. Understood. Chalo quickly. High chances of question coming from here because of amendments. For every 1 lakh of amount involved, 1000 fees you have to pay. Maximum 25,000. Oh yes, also minimum fees is 5,000. Yes. So if ma'am, my matter relates only, if let's say the case that I'm appealing against is only for 3 lakh rupees, it comes as 3,000, no. Still minimum fees of 5,000, so I have to pay. Sorry, I skipped on this point. Minimum fees is 5,000 and maximum fees is 25,000. So if the tax that I'm disputing is less than 5 lakh rupees, then also at least 5,000 I have to pay. And if the tax that I'm disputing is more than 25 lakh, then also maximum 25,000 only I'll be required to pay. So 5k to 25k is the range of fees that will be applicable. Clear? Withdrawal, nothing new, same as appellate authority, only 15 days and 7 days is the difference. Memorandum of cross objection, okay, rest everything is similar. Now we will be going to appellate tribunal. Earlier, appellate tribunal only used to listen to the appeals that would come against appellate authority, but now government has empowered appellate tribunal to also hear the cases with respect to anti-profiteering provisions. In miscellaneous chapter, I am going to teach you anti-profiteering. At that point of time, this will be more clear to you what exactly is anti-profiteering and how the appellate tribunal is going to listen to the cases. Yes, ma'am. So clarification regarding the monetary limits fixed by the authority. GST tribunal, it is GST appellate tribunal. 20 lakh, High Court 1 crore, Supreme Court 2 crore. Now which amounts I have to take in 20 lakh, 1 crore and 2 crore. So first of all, if the matter that is disputed is for tax, now it can be only tax, it can be tax plus interest plus penalty, with interest, without interest, with penalty, without penalty. But whenever tax is involved, I only have to see the tax that is disputed. Total. CGST, SGST, IGST, everything total till 20 lakh, 1 crore or 2 crore I will see. Which means, ma'am, without interest, without penalty, yes. If it is only tax, then you see only tax. If it is tax with or without interest or with or without penalty, you but still have to see only the amount of aggregate tax and dispute that is involved. Now, this will include CGST, SGST, UTGST, IGST, compensation cess, everything. It will not include interest and penalty here. But ma'am, the matter that I am disputing is not for tax. The matter that I am disputing is only for interest, only for penalty, only for late fees, what to do. Then you see that amount of interest, penalty or late fees. So we are saying that if the appeal is without tax, if the appeal is without tax for other amounts, that is, let's say interest, penalty, late fees without involving tax, then you take all these amounts. If it is for interest, you take total of interest. It should be less than 20 lakh, 1 crore, 2 crore. If it is for penalty, for late fees, or if it is interest plus penalty plus late fees without tax, then you can take these amounts, and these amounts should be less than 20 lakh, 1 crore or 2 crore. Then officer will not file the appeal. However, if it is tax plus any of this amount, then only tax I have to see in the dispute to determine the monetary limit. If it is for refund, whatever refund amount is involved, including CSI, GST, that amount I have to check. If it is up to 20 lakh, 1 crore, 2 crore, it is okay. The department should refrain from filing the appeals. Are you understanding? Say yes, ma'am. So the monetary limit shall be applied on the disputed amount of tax, interest, penalty, late fees, as the case may be, for which you are filing the appeal. On only the disputed amount. Let us see. Let us say that the entire order is for 100 crore rupees. But what we are disputing is only 20 crore. I have to see 20 crore and apply the limits accordingly. So I don't have to see the amount of full order. I only have to see the amount that I am disputing. And for that disputed amount, 20 lakh, 1 crore or 2 crore limit is going to be applicable. Okay, ma'am. In a composite order which disposes more than one appeal or demand notices. Now, of course, it is possible that a single case is disposing the matters in respect of 2 or 3 show cause notices or orders. Ma'am, do I have to apply the monetary limits separately, or the monetary limits shall be combined for all the orders? The answer is I have to take a total. In this particular composite order, for this particular composite order, if 2 or more demand notices or orders are involved for which decision is given, I have to take total of tax, interest, penalty, late fees, everything as the case may be, on the amount total. not on individual orders. I don't have to then see the individual show cause notices or orders if they are all combined and decided together only. So now they become one case only. So total only I have to take for all and apply the limits accordingly. Right, ma'am. However, these monetary limits will not be applied even if for less than 20 lakh, less than 1 CR, less than 2 CR, I can go file appeal as department if the assessee has contravened, has made ultra wires provisions of GST or rules or regulations under GST. So either I am violating the sections of GST Act or I am violating the rules or regulations of GST Act. I am doing ultra wires everything to the Constitution of India, or let us say I am not abiding by any order, notification, instruction, circular, etc. issued by the government. So if I am contravening all the act's provisions, if I am holding everything ultra wire, then to of course for even, which means now the question of law gets involved. No. So here even for less than these amounts, the department is open to go and file an appeal. Nobody will stop them. Or if the matter is for valuation, classification, refund or place of supply. For these four particular matters also, you forget the monetary limits. For less than these amounts also, you can go and file an appeal. Valuation, classification, refund and place of supply, important for MCQ. Valuation, classification, refund and place of supply. Okay. Or let us say you are a repeat offender. First time when you did offense, it was less than 20 lakh. We thought let it be, we did not make appeal. Again, you are repeating the same offenses. So now department is saying that if for any issue which is recurring in nature, then also again you can go and make an appeal. See, first of all, this is all for section 120 about the department, not for us. So government is saying that it is on department to not file appeal. It is on department to not file appeal in these particular cases. Government has also given monetary limits that for less than these amounts you please don't make an appeal. However, for matters pertaining to valuation, classification, refund, place of supply, repeat offense or the entire question of law being held ultra vires. Done, ma'am. Chalo. So the officer has to respect these monetary limits while filing the appeals. The officer has to respect these monetary limits while filing the appeals, or where strictures or adverse comments have been passed and or at the cost has been imposed against the government department. Okay. Now here we are saying that any order which is issued by appellate tribunal, let's say, is against the department. What we are saying, the order is against the department. Some of the officer is held guilty. Some of the government department or officers are questioned and costs are imposed on them. Then even for less than this amount, they might decide to go and file appeal. What we are saying, if you are trying to recover more taxes from the taxpayer, then you don't file the appeal for these small amounts. But if the authority has questioned the officer only, the authority says that this officer is incorrect, the officer, why he will not file appeal? Of course, he will go and file appeal for even less than this amount. So if the government department or officers are kept in question or the officers are kept against the adverse comments, then they can of course go and file appeal for even less than this amount. Understood, ma'am? And then we are saying that if there is any case where the officer thinks, now this we have left it open on the officer's own point of view. Ayushi, your doubt here, if the officer feels that it is important, it is necessary, I should file appeal even if the amount is less, it is important in interest of revenue or justice, then the officer might decide to still go and file appeal. Otherwise, normally, he will always have to respect these time limits, make a total and decide what the matter is and then take a decision whether to file the appeal or not. And of course, again, non-filing for one person shall not preclude the officer to file the appeal for another person in similar situation where there are questions of law being involved or the monetary limit is exceeding. Say yes, understood. Any other case or cases where officer thinks fit, officer can still go appeal. Otherwise, normally always they are going to follow all these provisions and monetary limits. But for valuation, classification, refund, and place of supply and a repeat offense, it's okay even if they are not complying with the monetary limits. Done and clear to everyone. Nothing tough as such, but okay, important because amendment. Tell me quickly, yes, so here we wind up the entire chapter of appeals and revisions. Chalo, tell me yes ma'am, it's done. Awaiting your replies. Chalo. The amendment simply says that section 120 tells the officers to not file appeals unnecessarily because we already have a lot of burden of cases. If the amounts for tribunal 20 lakh, High Court 1 crore, Supreme Court 2 crore, you don't file appeals. However, if you feel that it is important in justice and revenue, you can still file appeals. While considering this 20 lakh, 1 crore, 2 crore, if it is a tax involving amount, I'll be only taking the tax. But without tax, if the other amounts I'm disputing, then these other amounts I'm going to take. If the person has contravened the entire law, means the question of law is involved, then you can go file appeal. Or if the question is for valuation, classification, refund, place of supply or repeat offense, then also you can go and file an appeal. Done, Ayushi? Say yes, ma'am.